He seemed like just a stubborn old man who had refused to sell his plot of land in the middle of the city for decades. Developers offered millions, promised apartments and wealth, but he always said no. Everyone thought he was strange and even crazy, but when he died and people entered his house, they finally learned the truth. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The city was alive with a pulse that never seemed to fade, a great beast of steel and glass that stretched higher and higher with each passing year. Towers rose like jagged teeth into the gray sky, their mirrored surfaces reflecting the glow of advertisements, neon signs, and the restless march of headlights crawling along avenues below. Noise lived here as if it were another citizen. The roar of buses, the sharp horns of impatient drivers, the rumble of trains passing beneath the earth, and above it all the faint hum of air conditioning units clinging to the sides of every building. The streets carried an endless river of people who hurried with lowered eyes and fast steps, each consumed by their own tasks, ambitions, and battles. Amid this urban tide, nothing seemed to pause. Nothing seemed to resist change. And yet, at the very heart of it all, there was a single anomaly that no one could overlook. In the shadow of skyscrapers, on a modest stretch of ground that glowed green against the suffocating gray, stood an old wooden house with a small garden. It was as though time had forgotten to carry it forward, leaving it stranded while the world around it hurtled into the future. A patch of grass spread around the home, dotted with flowers that somehow managed to bloom despite the pollution of the city. A large oak tree spread its branches protectively above the roof, its leaves catching the faint light that trickled down between the towering buildings. To the people who walked by, it was almost comical, as if someone had tried to plant a memory of the countryside in the middle of the metropolis. Children would tug on their parents' hands and ask why such an old house was still standing there, and the adults would shrug, for they too wondered at its presence. The man who lived inside was known to all who passed by, though few truly knew him. Henry Brown, a tall, thin, dark-skinned man with hair silvered by age, had lived there longer than most of the new city's residents had been alive. His posture remained proud despite his years, his back straight even when he bent to tend the soil of his garden. His hands were broad and scarred, bearing the history of decades of labor, but his eyes were clear, calm, and quietly defiant. Henry had lived through wars, through riots, through political promises that had come and gone like seasons, but none of those forces had ever shaken his roots from this small piece of land. Developers had circled him like vultures for decades, each new company certain they could succeed where others had failed. They arrived in polished cars, wearing expensive suits, carrying contracts thick with promises. They offered him more money than many could dream of, enough to live in comfort until the end of his days. Some tried charm, others intimidation, and still others attempted to guilt him with speeches about progress and modernization. Henry had listened, had nodded politely, and then had closed his door. He did not argue or shout, nor did he explain. His refusals were gentle but firm, as if they were simply a law of nature, immovable and unquestionable. Over time, stories about him spread. Some said he was stubborn for the sake of it, clinging to a past long gone. Others whispered that he hid something of great value inside his house, a treasure buried beneath the floorboards, or secrets locked away in the attic. A few dismissed him as an eccentric old man who enjoyed the attention, who took pleasure in defying powerful corporations. Yet there were also those who admired him, who saw in him a rare act of resistance against a world that seemed to consume everything pure, everything personal, everything rooted in memory. Henry himself paid little attention to what the city thought. His days followed the rhythm of his own heart, not the chaos outside his fence. Each morning he woke before the city had fully stirred, when the streets were still damp from the night and the air carried the faintest trace of dew. He brewed a cup of tea in a kettle that had belonged to his mother, then stepped outside to greet his garden. He watered the flowers, loosened the soil, and checked the vegetables that grew in neat rows at the back of the yard. Birds sometimes came to rest in the oak tree above him, their songs small but clear against the hum of the city. These rituals were his anchor, a thread that connected him not only to his land, but to the generations who had lived there before him. The house itself was no palace. Its wooden siding was faded, the paint peeling in places, but Henry repaired what he could with his own hands. The roof had been patched more than once, and the windows were cleaned regularly, reflecting a surprising clarity compared to the grime-coated glass of nearby towers. Inside, the rooms smelled faintly of old wood, books, and the lavender his wife had once loved to grow. Everything was arranged with care, every object in its place, as though the house itself were a living memory. Those few who had stepped through the door left with a sense of something sacred, though most dismissed the feeling quickly, preferring not to think too deeply about why one old man's house unsettled them so. And yet, the pressure around him never ceased. Each year another building rose, stealing the light, shrinking the sky visible from his yard. Each month another letter came, another call, another stranger at his door. Each time, Henry's answer was the same. The city grew restless. Why should one man stand in the way of progress? Why should one house be allowed to remain when so many others had fallen? The murmurs of resentment joined the ever-present whispers of curiosity, and soon Henry's home was not only a symbol of defiance, but also a kind of legend whispered on the sidewalks. Henry knew what the world said about him, but he did not mind. He felt the weight of history pressing gently on his shoulders, and he carried it willingly. This land was more than soil. It was a vessel of lives lived, joys celebrated, and sorrows endured. It was a thread in a tapestry that reached further back than the skyscrapers, further even than the city itself. And while he breathed, he would not let that thread be cut. As the years passed, Henry grew older, his steps slower, his hair whiter. Yet his determination remained unshaken. He would sit on his porch in the evenings, watching the glow of the city lights spread across the horizon, listening to the sound of traffic rising like waves. The house around him creaked and whispered, alive with memories, and he sat as its guardian, silent but steadfast. The city moved, the world rushed, the future pressed forward, but Henry's house stood firm, green and bright against the gray, and Henry himself, tall and proud despite his years, remained the man at its center, the last reminder that some things cannot be bought, some things cannot be erased, and some roots grow too deep to be pulled from the earth. The days in Henry Brown's house unfolded with a rhythm that no longer belonged to the city outside his fence. While traffic lights blinked endlessly, while buses roared down avenues and construction cranes lifted steel higher into the sky, within his yard there was a slower current, something closer to the turning of the seasons than the ticking of a clock. To those who glanced over the gate, Henry seemed to live in a world sealed off from their own, and perhaps that was true. His life was not built on schedules, profit, or the rush of ambition. It was instead anchored to memory, to duty, and to the simple rituals that kept his solitude from becoming despair. Each morning began before dawn, when the skyscrapers still loomed in shadow and the air was cool, carrying a hint of freshness before the heat of exhaust and engines filled it. Henry rose from his bed quietly, as though careful not to disturb anyone, even though no one else had slept in that house for many years. He washed his face in a porcelain basin, the same one that had been there since his parents' time, and pulled on the clothes he wore for labor. Faded trousers, a shirt soft with age, and boots that had carried him across decades of seasons. Then he lit the stove, an old iron thing with a stubborn door, and boiled water in the kettle his mother once held. The whistle was always the same sharp note, and it filled the silent kitchen like a memory returning each morning. With a steaming cup of tea in his hand, he would step out into the garden. Even here, surrounded on all sides by walls of concrete and glass, the soil held life. Rows of vegetables lined the back, beans curling upward along strings he had tied between posts, carrots buried in the dark earth, tomatoes swelling under the sun. At the front, his wife's roses still bloomed, though the hands that once trimmed them with such love had long been gone. Henry tended them carefully, pruning the branches, watering when the ground was dry, whispering words no one else would ever hear. The great oak tree, planted by his grandfather before the city had devoured the horizon, spread its arms above it all. Birds still came to rest there, a small rebellion of nature that ignored the roar of engines and the stench of gasoline. When the city finally awoke, Henry's work was already well underway. He often spent hours repairing small things around the house, patching a roof tile that had cracked in the last rain, oiling the hinges of the door, sanding down the porch rail that had begun to splinter. He did it not out of necessity, for no one visited and no one cared, but because he believed the house deserved dignity. It had stood through storms, through riots, through decades of indifference. It had sheltered his parents, his wife, his children. To let it fall into ruin would be to betray them. Inside, the house spoke in quiet voices. The wood creaked when he walked down the hallway, the floors groaning like old friends. The smell of lavender still clung faintly to the curtains, a reminder of his wife, Clara, who had planted sachets in the drawers and hung dried bundles from the kitchen rafters. In the living room, dust gathered on frames that held photographs, and each time he passed them, Henry paused. His hand would hover over the glass, tracing the outlines of faces. His daughter smiling with missing teeth, his son clutching a toy plane, his wife's eyes bright under the sunlight of summers long gone. He lingered, then moved on, but the house kept those faces alive in every corner. There was another ritual that puzzled the neighbors. Each evening, as the city lights began to glitter like countless stars, Henry moved from room to room, switching on lamps. It was not for him, for he did not linger there. He simply lit them, stood in the doorway for a moment, then left. From the street, those who walked by sometimes counted the glow of windows, first in the bedroom, then the upstairs hallway, then the children's room with its soft yellow lamp, and finally the parlor. People whispered about it. Some thought it was superstition, others thought it was proof of madness. Yet Henry never explained. He only carried on, night after night, keeping the house alive with light, as though honoring unseen guests. In the shop nearby, clerks recognized him. He was polite, his voice soft, his manner calm. He bought only what he needed: flour, tea, a little sugar, occasionally a bit of meat. He always carried his groceries in the same worn basket, nodding politely to those who greeted him. Children sometimes stared, for his figure seemed to belong to another age. But Henry did not mind. He had no desire for the city's luxuries, no need for the gadgets that lined the shelves. His world was enough. But inside that quiet rhythm was a current of grief, He carried it silently, with dignity, never spilling it into the streets. Yet in the evenings, when he sat at the small table in the kitchen, he sometimes stared at the empty chairs around him, his tea cooling in his hand. The silence then was heavier, pressing against the walls, reminding him of laughter that once filled the house. He remembered Clara humming while she cooked, remembered his son arguing about school, remembered his daughter's footsteps rushing down the stairs. These were not just recollections, they were presences, shadows of a life that had left the house but never truly departed. Henry kept them alive by preserving everything exactly as it had been. He dusted his daughter's shelves where stuffed animals sat patiently, waiting. He kept the science books in his son's room stacked neatly. He aired the sheets in the bedroom his wife had once arranged so carefully. Nothing had been moved, nothing altered. To outsiders, it might have seemed like a refusal to let go, but for Henry it was devotion, a sacred duty. The city often forgot he existed. Weeks passed with no visitors, no letters, no disturbances except the endless hum beyond the fence. Yet Henry never felt himself forgotten by those who truly mattered. He carried their voices inside him, their touch in his memory. Each corner of the house was a reminder that love once lived there, and he would not allow it to be erased. And so he lived, the quiet keeper of something the city no longer understood. While cranes lifted steel into the sky and traffic choked the streets, Henry's days moved to the rhythm of watering cans, the creak of wood, the scent of roses. The world outside might rush forward endlessly, but within his fence, time bent and slowed, turning not in circles of progress, but in spirals of remembrance. He knew the world thought him stubborn. He knew the developers cursed his name behind closed doors. He knew people laughed, calling him a relic, a shadow. But Henry did not care. For every time he stepped into the garden and felt the soil beneath his boots, every time he lit a lamp in the stillness of evening, every time he touched a photograph on the wall, he knew he was guarding something priceless. His land, his home, his memories, these were not simply his. They belonged to all those who had lived before him, and to betray them would be to betray himself. Thus the quiet life of the keeper continued, steady and unbroken. The skyscrapers leaned closer each year, shadows swallowing more of the sunlight, but the small patch of green remained. The house stood, the garden grew, and Henry kept watch, silent but unwavering. Though the city pressed in, though the world demanded change, within those wooden walls time stood still, and Henry himself remained the steadfast guardian of memory. The days drifted on, and Henry's routine continued as it always had, but outside his fence the city's hunger grew sharper. The buildings did not simply rise anymore. They seemed to lean in toward his house, as though conspiring to swallow it whole. Glass towers reflected the sun into his windows until the evenings, when their lights glared down like watchful eyes. Henry had long grown used to being surrounded, but now the pressure was more than just a background murmur. The city had decided it was time to end the story of the lone house in the middle of progress. One afternoon, when Henry was returning from the shop with his basket of bread and tea, he found an envelope wedged under his gate. It was heavier than the usual letters, printed with the insignia of a company he recognized. He carried it inside, placed it on the table, and stared at it for a long while. He already knew what it would say, but habit and dignity demanded he read it. With careful fingers, he unfolded the papers and scanned the typed lines. They spoke in the same cold language that every such letter had used before, but this one carried sharper edges. It declared that the land had been officially rezoned, that the company's rights had been expanded, that his refusal to sell was now subject to legal challenge. It warned that if he continued to resist, the matter would be taken to court, where, it assured him, the outcome was inevitable. Henry folded the letter neatly and placed it back on the table. For a moment, he sat in silence, listening to the clock ticking on the wall, the faint sound of traffic humming outside. He felt no fear, no panic, only a deep weariness. They had been circling him for years, but this was the first time their words carried the weight of real threat. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at his garden. The roses swayed gently in the breeze, and the oak tree whispered above them. Nothing here felt threatened. Nothing here knew of zoning laws and courtrooms. The soil beneath his feet belonged to him in a way no document could ever challenge. Days later, a delegation arrived. 3 men in pressed suits stood at his gate, their shoes gleaming, their voices rehearsed with confidence. They did not knock timidly. They rang the bell and waited with the posture of people who believed the answer was already theirs. Henry opened the door, leaning on the frame, his face calm, his eyes steady. They began their speech at once, reciting promises of compensation, of apartments with every comfort, of the security of never having to labor again. They painted images of his twilight years filled with ease, of warmth and convenience, of freedom from struggle. Behind their words, though, was the edge of steel. Hints of legal force, veiled reminders of how little choice he had left. Henry listened, just as he always had. He did not interrupt, nor did he show anger. When they had finished, he let the silence stretch between them until even their polished confidence faltered. Then, with a voice that was neither loud nor sharp but carried the weight of stone, he answered, "This land leaves me only when I leave it, not before." His words were not spoken with defiance but with finality, as though they were not his decision but the law of the earth itself. The men exchanged uneasy glances. They pressed again, but Henry had already stepped back, closing the door gently. The latch clicked, and with it the conversation ended. That evening, Henry sat on the porch as the sun lowered itself behind the towers. The sky was painted in streaks of orange and purple, though much of it was swallowed by the skyline. He watched the light fade across the garden, the shadows lengthening, the air cooling. His body ached more than it once had, his breaths came slower, and he knew with clarity that his time was drawing short. He thought of Clara, of how she used to sit beside him in evenings like this, humming softly as she embroidered. He thought of his children racing through the yard, their laughter rising like birdsong. He thought of the many nights he had stood in the doorway of their rooms, watching them sleep before turning off the lights. All of it lingered here still, wrapped into the boards of the house, the soil of the garden, the bark of the oak tree. Henry closed his eyes and breathed deeply, letting the air settle within him. He did not fear the end. He had lived long enough to know that endings were part of the same circle as beginnings. What he feared was erasure, the careless sweep of progress that could wipe away the traces of lives that had given meaning to this land. That was why he refused. That was why he stood, even now, when the city pressed harder than ever before. He was not merely keeping a house. He was keeping memory itself alive, holding fast against the tide until his hands could no longer hold. Night fell. From beyond the fence came the noise of traffic, horns echoing, voices drifting through the humid air. But inside the yard, all was quiet. Henry rose, walked from room to room and lit the lamps, as he always did. The glow spread gently across each space, casting warm circles of light on familiar walls. In the daughter's room, the stuffed animals watched silently. In his son's study, the books gleamed softly under the lamp. In the bedroom, the bedspread caught the golden light, as though Clara herself had just smoothed it out. And finally, in the parlor, he stood a moment longer, watching the flicker of shadows. When every room was alive again, he allowed himself a small smile. The last refusal had been spoken. The men in suits would return, perhaps with lawyers, perhaps with police. The letters would grow more severe. But Henry knew he had said what mattered, and he knew he had spoken the truth not only for himself, but for those who could no longer speak. The house still stood, the lights still burned, and until his breath ceased, the land remained his. The letter still lay on the kitchen table, folded with care as though it were another relic instead of a threat, and the echoes of Henry's final words to the men in suits seemed to linger in the air of the house long after they had gone. The pressure from outside did not fade. Each day, the city's pulse throbbed more insistently beyond the fence. Trucks groaned through the streets, carrying the skeletons of new buildings that rose like weeds after a storm, and the voices of neighbors carried whispers of the inevitable. Everyone believed that Henry's stand was nearing its end. Yet, inside the house, life continued with the same rhythm as always. He watered the roses, he tended the beans, he lit the lamps at dusk. To anyone watching, he looked unchanged. But within him, Henry knew his own time was slipping quietly away. The nights grew heavier. When he lay down in the bed that had once held Clara's warmth, his chest rose with more effort. His breath stretched long, as though his lungs carried stones instead of air. Yet there was no fear, only the deep fatigue of a man who had walked further than most ever dared, who had carried the weight of memory on his shoulders without complaint. He moved slower from room to room, his steps less steady, but his resolve remained unbroken. The house still received his care, the garden his attention, and the lamps their nightly ritual. One evening, as twilight settled across the city and the neon glow of advertisements began to wash the sky, Henry sat on the porch longer than usual. The sunset was mostly hidden by towers now, but through the narrow gap between two skyscrapers, a thin ribbon of orange still stretched across the horizon. He gazed at it quietly, his face calm, as though measuring its color against the memory of 1,000 sunsets he had seen from that same spot. He thought of Clara's laughter, of the way she would pause at the door to call the children inside for supper, of the smell of cornbread baking in the kitchen. Those memories filled him more completely than the air around him, and he let them settle over him like a quilt. Later that night, he walked through the house one last time. His hand brushed against the doorframe of each room as he passed, as though he were blessing them in silence. The daughter's room held her stuffed animals still lined in perfect rows, their small button eyes waiting patiently. The son's study still bore the notebooks filled with sketches of machines, projects left unfinished but never discarded. In the bedroom, Clara's dress still hung on the back of the chair, its faded fabric catching the lamplight in soft folds. Henry paused there, touching the wood of the chair gently before moving on. When he reached the parlor, he lit the final lamp, then lowered himself into his chair. The light wrapped around him and the house seemed to exhale, alive with the glow of every memory it contained. Henry closed his eyes. His breath slowed, and in the stillness of the night, while the city roared outside, Henry Brown passed quietly from the world. His death made little noise in the city that claimed to value progress above all else. The next morning, neighbors noticed the curtains remained drawn, the lamps unlit. A few hours later, word spread quickly down the street, and by the evening, a single line appeared in the local newspaper: Henry Brown, longtime resident and landowner in the Central District, has passed away at the age of 86. No mention was made of his defiance, his garden, or the years he had stood alone against corporations. For the city, his death was nothing more than the opening of a door, the removal of an obstacle. Within days, the paperwork was complete. The company that had long desired the land wasted no time. Their lawyers, who had prepared for this outcome for years, filed the final documents with almost celebratory efficiency. In the glass offices overlooking the skyline, men and women in tailored suits shook hands, congratulated one another, and spoke of the new tower that would soon rise. They congratulated themselves for outlasting the old man, for proving that time itself was on their side. His refusal had meant nothing in the end, they told themselves, for all things yield to progress eventually. The following week, a group of company representatives arrived at the house to conduct their inspection. They expected ruin: dusty rooms, sagging furniture, perhaps rodents in the walls. They expected the decay of neglect, the scent of mildew and abandonment. Instead, as they crossed the threshold, they were greeted by silence so profound it seemed to echo. The air inside was not rancid, but faintly scented with lavender. Dust did not choke the shelves, for Henry had kept them clean until the end. The floors creaked beneath their polished shoes, but the boards were strong. They glanced at one another, surprised, as they realized that this was not a ruin, but a sanctuary. The men and women walked deeper into the house, their footsteps softening as if instinct told them to tread lightly. They found the rooms preserved as though the inhabitants had only stepped out for a moment and would soon return. In the daughter's room, the bedspread was smooth, and the shelves bore neat rows of rabbits and dolls, each with its own place. In the son's study, books and papers lay ordered on the desk, a small lamp ready to be switched on. The master bedroom bore Clara's dress still resting on the chair, a quiet sentinel of a life lived with grace. Everywhere they looked, they saw not abandonment, but care, not emptiness, but presence. Then, in the living room, they stopped. Covering the far wall was something they had not expected: a hand-drawn family tree, its branches stretching wide across the plaster, its names written carefully in ink that had faded but not vanished. It carried them back through decades, tracing Henry's children, his parents, his grandparents, and further still to names marked with dates from the age of bondage, when his ancestors had been forced into fields against their will. The ink told a story of survival, of roots planted deeply in soil that had once been watered by sweat and sorrow. The representatives stood in silence, their polished confidence shaken. They read the names aloud in whispers, stumbling over the faded letters, their eyes stinging, though none of them wanted to admit it. For the first time, the house revealed itself not as a simple building, but as a vessel of history, of love, of lives woven into the land for generations. Outside, the city roared on, unaware. Inside, the visitors lingered, unable to break the silence that seemed to demand reverence. They had come expecting to measure square footage, to draft demolition plans, to take photographs for the records. Instead, they found themselves humbled, their tasks forgotten in the face of a truth too heavy to ignore. Henry was gone, but the house remained, and within its walls his family's presence breathed still. The sale was done, the land legally theirs. Yet, as they left that evening, one by one, none of them spoke with the triumph they had expected to feel. Their eyes were red, their steps slower. They knew they would carry the memory of that house with them, whether they wished it or not. For though the city had claimed the land, something within those walls had claimed them in return. When the delegation returned a few days later, it was not just a handful of managers with clipboards and polished shoes. This time, the company sent architects, lawyers, and even photographers to document what they believed would be the first step in transforming Henry Brown's land into yet another tower of glass and steel. They walked through the gate with brisk confidence, as though the earth itself now recognized their ownership. The oak tree above them rustled, its branches spreading against the looming backdrop of skyscrapers, and a few of the newcomers glanced up uneasily. Still, they pushed forward, eager to finish the inspection and file their reports. The moment they crossed the threshold of the house, their voices lowered as though swallowed by the air itself. The silence inside was different from the noise outside, deeper and heavier, like a presence that watched them carefully. The lavender scent remained faint but persistent, a quiet ghost of Clara's hand still woven into the curtains and the corners of drawers. Dust motes floated gently in the light that slipped through the windows, turning the rooms golden. At first, the visitors moved in groups, making notes, snapping photographs, but soon their steps slowed and their words faltered as they began to see the house not with the eyes of developers, but with the uneasy recognition of intruders. They entered the parlor first. The chairs were neatly arranged, the old wooden table polished smooth by years of careful hands. Photographs lined the walls, and though the faces within them were from another time, the clarity of their expressions made the strangers feel suddenly exposed. A young girl with braids smiled with missing teeth, a boy grinned while holding a model airplane, and a woman's gaze held warmth that seemed to reach across decades. It was as if the family themselves had paused only a moment ago, as if they might step back into the room and ask why these strangers were trespassing. The architects, who had been preparing to measure the angles of the walls, found themselves standing motionless, their instruments idle in their hands. In the daughter's room, the stillness pressed even heavier. The bedspread was tucked perfectly, and the shelves were crowded with stuffed rabbits, each one carefully cleaned and placed as though waiting to be played with again. The faded pink walls carried drawings of flowers and suns taped carefully, their colors dulled with time, but still vibrant with the touch of a child's imagination. One woman among the delegation covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes stinging as she thought of her own daughter's toys scattered across a floor miles away. She turned to speak, but the words refused to form. Upstairs, the son's study drew a hush that no one dared break. The desk was crowded with notebooks, sketches of machines, and diagrams of inventions that hinted at the curiosity of a boy who dreamed of building wonders. A half-finished model of a small bridge sat carefully in the corner, its wooden pieces arranged in a pattern of patience. Dust had gathered lightly, but nothing was broken, nothing discarded. It was as though Henry had walked through the room each morning, making sure his son's projects were safe, guarding them long after the boy himself had gone. The men who prided themselves on logic and numbers looked at the sketches as if they had stumbled upon something sacred. One of them, unable to help himself, whispered, "He kept it all," and the sound of his voice seemed to disturb the air like a trespass. They descended again into the master bedroom, where Clara's presence still lingered in the quiet folds of fabric. The dress on the chair, carefully draped, bore the faded elegance of a life cut short but preserved with love. The bed was neatly made, the pillows smooth, the quilt stretched taut. No one moved quickly there. They stepped lightly, as though a woman's voice might still echo if they disturbed the silence too loudly. For a moment, the house felt less like a place to be measured and more like a chapel, and each person within it bore the weight of that realization. And then they entered the living room where the family tree stretched across the wall. The photographs and toys had already shaken them, but this was different. This was not the memory of individuals, but the lineage of a people, painstakingly written by hand, each name inked with care. It was not a decoration, not an ornament. It was a declaration. Generations unfolded across the plaster, some names sharp and proud, others faded into the worn surface. Beside certain names were dates, births, and deaths, and in the oldest branches there were single words that carried the weight of centuries. Field hand, sold, freed. These words told stories more powerful than any speech, stories of struggle and survival that had rooted themselves into the very walls of the home. The delegation, so confident when they had arrived, now stood hushed as children in a classroom. Their eyes traveled across the names, tracing the branches that led to Henry himself, the last of the line to guard the soil beneath their feet. A few tried to blink away tears, others cleared their throats and looked down at their papers, as though paperwork could protect them from the truth they had just seen. Yet no one could deny the weight pressing upon them. This was not just land, not just a house. It was a living testimony of endurance, of love, of lives that refused to be forgotten. One of the lawyers, a man who had argued countless cases with cold precision, found himself wiping his eyes. Another, a woman whose voice usually carried authority, could not bring herself to speak above a whisper. The photographers lowered their cameras, unable to frame the moment without feeling that to capture it mechanically would be a violation. Slowly, they all realized that their task, to document, to plan demolition, to prepare for a future of concrete, was no longer simple. They had stepped into something larger, something that demanded not progress, but reverence. By the time they left the house, the sun had already dipped low behind the towers, casting long shadows across the yard. The oak tree's branches seemed to stretch further than before, as if shielding the home from their gaze. They closed the door gently, none daring to slam it, and walked back through the gate in silence. Their polished shoes crunched on the gravel, their briefcases swung loosely at their sides. None of them spoke of blueprints or profits. Their thoughts were filled with the rooms, the faces and photographs, the small artifacts of love that Henry had guarded until his final breath. That night, many of them lay awake in their apartments high above the city streets, listening to the hum of traffic far below. They thought of the stuffed rabbits waiting patiently on a shelf, of the sketches of a boy's inventions, of the faded dress draped over a chair. They thought of the names inked on a wall, names that carried the weight of chains and the pride of freedom. For the first time in years, these men and women, so practiced in the language of money and law, found themselves shaken by something they could neither measure nor purchase. The shock inside the house lingered far longer than they had expected. They had come to claim possession, to mark the first step of erasure. Instead, they had been claimed themselves, branded by a memory that refused to die. And though they did not yet know what would follow, each of them carried with them a new certainty, that Henry's house was not just a piece of land. It was a monument, and monuments do not fall easily, no matter how much steel and glass the city piles around them. The delegation left Henry Brown's house with their polished shoes dusted and their eyes red, and though they carried folders of documents and plans for the new tower, their steps no longer had the same certainty. Something inside those walls had unsettled them, and as they walked back into the noise of the city, it was as if they had been pulled out of one world and dropped again into another that no longer felt entirely familiar. For a few days, they tried to continue as if nothing had changed. They met in boardrooms, they placed their photographs on slides, they spoke of square footage and market potential. But their voices faltered, their sentences trailed off, and when their colleagues asked what they had seen, the answers came out in fragments that carried an unexpected weight. It was not long before the story began to spread. At first, it trickled quietly through conversations. An architect mentioned the preserved children's room to a journalist he knew. A lawyer, usually guarded, confessed to a friend that she had never seen anything like the family tree painted on the wall. The whispers carried with them an edge of awe, of disbelief, until curiosity grew too sharp to be contained. A young reporter from a local paper, intrigued by the hints of something extraordinary, requested access to the house. He stepped inside with his notebook and camera, and though he had come prepared to write a short piece about eccentric preservation, he found himself standing silent in the parlor, staring at the wall of names that reached back through centuries. He took no photographs at first. He simply stood, listening to the silence, before he realized that the silence itself was part of the story. When his article appeared, it was tucked in the middle of the paper, overshadowed by headlines about new developments, traffic accidents, and politics. But readers who stumbled upon it found themselves moved in a way few stories managed. The words painted the picture of an old man who had lived alone in defiance of progress, who had guarded his family's memory with the devotion of a soldier at his post. The description of the children's toys, the dress draped over the chair, the family tree marked with the scars of slavery and the triumph of freedom, these details clung to the minds of those who read them. Within hours, the piece was shared online, and then it traveled further, faster, until the name of Henry Brown was on the lips of thousands who had never noticed his house before. The city, which had long dismissed the old man as stubborn or eccentric, now saw him differently. People who had walked past his gate for years without a second glance now paused, peering through the fence as if expecting to glimpse the echoes described in the article. Neighbors spoke to reporters about the man they had watched tend his garden, about the lamps he lit each evening, about his silence that now seemed less like isolation and more like reverence. Parents brought their children to see the yard, pointing out the oak tree and telling them in words heavy with pride that some people guarded more than property. They guarded memory. Soon, crowds gathered. At first, it was just a handful of curious citizens, then more, until groups stood outside the house daily, whispering to each other, leaving flowers by the fence. Activists arrived, carrying placards that read, "History lives here," and "Some roots cannot be uprooted." Historians entered, tracing the lineage on the walls, confirming that Henry's ancestors had indeed lived on that land for more than a century. They spoke of how rare it was for such a direct link to survive untouched in a city that had devoured its past with relentless hunger. Teachers brought classes of students, guiding them through the rooms where the air still felt thick with presence. Some children stared at the toys, wide-eyed, while others asked questions that their teachers struggled to answer. The story of Henry Brown became more than a local curiosity. National outlets picked it up, their cameras capturing the sight of skyscrapers looming over a small wooden house that had become a shrine. Commentators spoke on television about resilience, about the meaning of land, about the difference between progress and erasure. Social media filled with images of the family tree, of the stuffed rabbits, of the faded dress. Hashtags spread, and soon Henry's house was known across the country as the last home. The developers, once triumphant, now found themselves caught in a storm they had not anticipated. Their plans for the tower were criticized as vandalism, their ambitions painted as greed that sought to trample over history. Protests swelled outside their offices, demanding that the house be preserved, that the memory Henry had protected not be erased in the name of profit. Shareholders grew nervous, politicians weighed in, and suddenly the project that had seemed like a guaranteed success became a liability. But beyond the politics and the protests, something deeper stirred in the city itself. People began to reflect on their own lives, on the homes their families had lost, on the photographs and letters tucked into boxes in their attics. Henry's story reminded them that history was not abstract, not distant. It lived in rooms, in objects, in the soil beneath their feet. It reminded them that memory, once destroyed, could never be rebuilt, no matter how tall the towers rose. In a city that had trained itself to forget in the name of progress, Henry's house forced them to remember. On a warm afternoon, a woman brought her father in a wheelchair to see the house. He was frail, his voice thin, but when he looked at the yard and the oak tree, tears welled in his eyes. He told his daughter that his own grandparents had lived in a house much like this before the city had swallowed their neighborhood. He remembered stories of gardens and porches, of evenings spent together before the world had turned so fast. Standing at Henry's gate, he felt for the first time in decades that a part of that world still lived. His daughter wept quietly beside him, and the crowd gave them space, recognizing the sacredness of their moment. The city was learning, slowly, painfully, but unmistakably. It was learning that not all progress could be measured in steel and glass. It was learning that the stubbornness of one man was not madness, but devotion, a devotion that now cast a light over everyone who paused to see it. The house had become a mirror in which the city saw itself, not as it wanted to be, but as it truly was. Hungry, hurried, forgetful, and for the first time in years it questioned whether that was enough. And so the story of Henry Brown, once confined to whispers and ridicule, became a banner under which people rallied. The truth of his life, the love he had carried silently, the memories he had preserved with ritual and resolve, all of it now belonged not only to him, but to the city that had almost erased him. What had been hidden within the quiet walls of a wooden house now echoed across streets and screens, forcing thousands to face the question Henry had answered with his entire life. What is worth keeping, even when the world demands you let it go? The protests grew with each passing week until the sidewalks outside Henry Brown's house were no longer quiet but filled with voices, placards, and songs. What had begun as whispers of curiosity after the first article became a swelling chorus that echoed through every corner of the city. People arrived with flowers and photographs of their own families, taping them to the fence as if to weave their memories into Henry's story. Candles burned at night, flickering against the towering glass facades that surrounded the small patch of green, their glow reflected in the darkened windows of skyscrapers like countless reminders that something sacred still stood in the shadow of steel. The company that had so confidently secured ownership of the land now found itself on the defensive. Its executives gave statements about progress, about housing needs, about the future of the city. But their words fell flat in the face of the images now spreading everywhere. Images of the children's toys, of Clara's dress, of the family tree written on the wall with names that carried centuries of struggle and survival. Every photograph shared online was like a spark that lit another fire in the hearts of those who saw it. The public no longer saw a plot of land. They saw history, devotion, and sacrifice. To tear it down would be an act of erasure too blatant for even the most hardened defenders of progress to justify. City officials could not ignore the movement. Council meetings that once passed unnoticed now filled with citizens demanding that the house be preserved. Petitions circulated, gathering signatures not only from locals but from people across the country who had never set foot in the city, yet felt the weight of Henry's story. Scholars spoke on television about the importance of tangible history, about how rare it was for a lineage to survive unbroken on a single piece of land in the midst of modern development. Activists reminded the public that Henry's resistance was not merely personal, but symbolic of countless others whose stories had already been erased in silence. At last, the council voted. The land would not be cleared for another tower. The house would remain. And more than that, it would be protected as a monument, preserved as a site of memory and reflection. The news spread quickly, and when it reached the crowds outside the fence, cheers rose into the night. Strangers embraced, tears streamed down faces, and for the first time in many years the city felt united in something other than commerce or crisis. They had chosen to keep memory alive. The work to transform the house into a museum did not erase Henry's presence. Care was taken with every room. The photographs on the walls remained where he had placed them. The daughter's room, with its stuffed rabbits and faded drawings, was preserved just as it had been. The son's study, with its notebooks and unfinished projects, was carefully secured so that visitors could peer inside and see the dreams Henry had protected. Clara's dress was placed behind glass, not hidden away, so that her quiet grace would remain visible to all who entered. And the family tree, painted across the plaster, was restored with delicate care, and its fading ink preserved so that the names could continue to speak for generations. Around the house, the city approved the creation of a small park. Where once developers had imagined a skyscraper casting shadows over the block, there were now paths lined with trees, benches where people could sit, and a pond where birds came to drink. Children played in the grass, their laughter echoing against the tall buildings, and the oak tree spread its branches as though in gratitude, its roots deepening into soil that would no longer be threatened. The air felt lighter there, cleaner, as if the memory Henry had guarded so fiercely had breathed new life into the heart of the city. Visitors arrived from far and wide. Families walked through the rooms with hushed voices, parents bending down to explain to their children that this house had been saved because one man believed some things were too precious to lose. School groups filled the halls, their teachers pointing to the family tree on the wall, reminding their students that history was not just words in books, but lives lived in places like this. Some stood before the wall of names and traced them silently with their eyes, their lips moving as they whispered prayers or promises. Others left notes by the fence, thanking Henry for his courage, promising that they would remember. For the people of the city, the house became more than a monument. It was a reminder that even in a world of relentless change, there were truths worth preserving. It reminded them that their own families had stories, that their own lives carried roots deeper than the pavement beneath their feet. For those who had dismissed Henry as stubborn or strange, the house now stood as proof that he had not been guarding land but guarding memory, carrying it until others were ready to see its worth. At dusk, when the lamps inside the house were lit each evening by caretakers, the glow spilled out onto the street, just as it had when Henry himself had made his nightly rounds. Passers-by paused to watch, their faces softened in the warm light, as though the old man's spirit still moved through the rooms, keeping his vigil. The city roared on around it, cars rushing, towers gleaming, but inside the fence there was peace, and that peace touched all who came near. The monument did not stand as a relic of resistance alone, but as a beacon of continuity. It told the story of one man and his family, but also of countless others who had lived, struggled, and loved in the face of a world that often sought to forget them. It told of the cost of progress when it tramples over memory, and of the strength of devotion that refuses to let go. And so, in the very heart of a city that had once pressed against it with hunger, Henry's house remained, not as an obstacle but as a center, a place where the noise quieted, where lives were remembered, where children laughed again in the shadow of an oak tree. The city had gained towers and profit in many places, but here it had gained something rarer, the soul of a man who had refused to let memory die. And though Henry himself was gone, his presence filled every room, every corner, every lamp that cast its light into the night. Among the steel and glass, among the endless rush of progress, the small wooden house stood, green and bright, its walls breathing with history. It had become a monument not only to Henry Brown, but to the truth that some things, love, memory, and the dignity of holding on, are worth more than anything the world can build in their place. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next unbelievable story. Click to watch the next video right now. You won't believe what happens there. And share this video with your friends so they can discover it too.